So most of the problems that we experience in life happen at an unconscious level. So certainly when we're falling into anxiety and we're falling into other things, we're ostensibly putting ourselves into trance. Because what we're doing is we're saying to ourselves, I have this problem. This is going to happen to me. This is happening in the future. This is going to happen. This is what's going to happen to me. And it ends up in a sort of situation where we create a hypnotic trance through that, telling ourselves this story and narrowing our focus so much that we end up in a situation where it's really difficult for us to see beyond that.
But I guess the place I want to start this conversation is, how does hypnotherapy and the work that you do differentiate potentially from psychodynamic psychotherapy, psychology, and various practices like that?
Interesting question, because they're tied together to some extent, in the sense that hypnosis has been around for a very long time, sort of over 5,000 years, and it's one of those things where people have got some dramatic results with it. The issue with psychotherapy was, I suppose it comes down to the fact that people are trying to determine how do we work, what's going on, how do we help people to resolve the issues they're going through. Freud himself, who obviously is the father of the psychodynamics, was involved in hypnotherapy. So he was involved in hypnotherapy. The sort of argument is that apparently he had a bit of a lisp, struggled a bit to communicate and didn't quite like it. And then there was apparently a lady who became rather enamored with him after he'd done some hypnotherapy with her. And then he gave up hypnotherapy, not quite liking that sort of thing, and left to try and study what he could come up with himself. The sort of lore about this, or the story about this, is that apparently, obviously, he still knew some of these people in the school that they were all practicing together, and he brought somebody in who had an issue, and I can't remember exactly what the issue was, but he brought this guy in and asked one of his hypnotherapy friends if he could actually help this guy to have this cured. And he watched as this doctor did this hypnotherapy on this guy, and then the guy suddenly is miraculously cured. And then what he'd heard in that is that the guy had gone back into his past. And so he believed that all problems are based in the past. And therefore he went away and developed psychodynamic, psychoanalysis, which really meant, and says, I can cure anybody, but it's going to take like hundreds and hundreds of hours. And he announced this to the world. And then we started to develop this idea of psychoanalysis. So hypnotherapy sort of ties in with that. And hypnotherapy in itself isn't actually a therapy per se. It's what we're actually doing is we're using the element of trance, a thing which is natural to all of us, to actually have a conversation with the part of us that's actually running the show, which is the unconscious mind. So most of the problems that we experience in life happen at an unconscious level. So certainly when we're falling into anxiety and we're falling into other things, we're ostensibly putting ourselves into trance. Because what we're doing is we're saying to ourselves, I have this problem. This is going to happen to me. This is happening in the future. This is going to happen. This is what's going to happen to me. And it ends up in a sort of situation where we create a hypnotic trance through that, telling ourselves this story and narrowing our focus so much that we end up in a situation where it's really difficult for us to see beyond that. And so, we can try with behavioural techniques, because that's the problem now, I think, is psychology's gone very much more towards behavioural science. And so it's trying to sort of fix us, which is like trying to work with a car and thinking that we're a machine that we can be fixed. But in truth, we're far more than that. And I think we miss the point that the unconscious mind is the bit that's actually driving the show. And so to actually have a conversation with that unconscious mind is paramount. But to do that, we have to get to a point where we're quite relaxed. And so, I think hypnotherapy helps us obviously to get to that space, helps us to find ourselves in a place where we can actually start to work out what's really going on. Because the way I'd look at it, Luke, is that, to be honest with you, I don't think anybody's actually particularly broken. And that might sound controversial. And I know I put a video out and there's some people who are disagreeing but a lot of people were agreeing and thinking that's good news to hear. But I've worked with people for a long time, and I think everything that people do is a way of managing the situation they're facing. So it's trying to manage as best as they can with the resources they have available what's happening to them. And so, we do that with what we've got available, but where did we learn how to manage those situations? We all picked that up from somewhere way back in the past, and sometimes we don't have all the information available. Does that make any sense? Or am I just rambling?
Yeah, I mean, the experience I had recently with this that I guess elicited some of this thinking around this, or accessed the part of my mind where I started thinking about this, was with this podcast. Actually, I had a hard time when I first started doing it again. Prior to that, I was doing it, a couple of times a week, and then I put it on pause for a bit. But prior, this was a few weeks ago, I had a really hard time speaking on the camera. I'd feel my throat tighten up. I'd feel my body tighten up. And, in my mind, I'm thinking of, I'm comparing myself to this ideal of how I had to be. But even further than that, the difficult part for me, from a logical point of view of how I saw it, and I've used the word logical a fair bit, but it's that I saw myself in a social settings going out, I don't drink alcohol. I'll go out clubbing, not recently, but I have in the past many times, completely sober. Gone out to, events and things and completely sober, and was able to access this part of myself that was completely carefree, confident. And I struggled with that for a long time as a kid, since I was, 7 or 8 years old. And that feeling started coming back to me all of a sudden. And it happened occasionally as well when in high pressure situations, or what I perceived to be high pressure. And I had a conversation with a sports psychologist some time ago. And she said to me, I said, what is the one thing that's most important when it comes to someone performing well? And she said, clarity of mind. And it made me ask myself, what was the part of my mind, the part of my body that I was accessing or tapping into when I came onto these podcasts and I started speaking like that? And I thought about it. It was this version of myself, and I'd love to speak to this eventually, but this is a version of myself that was this kid again, almost like a teenager, 7 or 8 years old, where the solution for me to protect myself was to restrict myself. So what I started doing, and I even did this before this podcast, and I don't always do it, but when I remember that feeling come up, I remind myself of all the times where I've accessed that freedom and that carefreeness in my expression when I'm going out and I'm like public speaking, or when I'm in front of an audience of a whole bunch of people, and how I felt, and that freedom and that kind of flow and connecting ideas and dots. And I remind myself of that, and it brings me to a place of freedom. So I guess with that example in mind, and feel free to ask questions and whatever, we don't have to make it super formal, but what about that, and what have you seen in your practice makes someone experience something they don't enjoy, like tightness in their throat? It could be anything. It could be social anxiety. It could be anxiety. It could be, always entering these states of depression. What about those states of minds do we create for ourselves? It's like speaking of Carl Jung and Freud and things like that, one of the most interesting things, and I'm going a few tangents here, but I'll bring it back full circle. One of the most interesting things is a quote that I read, and I'm paraphrasing here in my own words, is the scariest truth about human nature is that we secretly, or rather consciously or unconsciously, create the circumstances in our life, and we secretly want those bad things in our life. So what about those bad things do we create for ourselves? And I guess, how do we create them, and how can we undo them? I suppose
when you look at it from that perspective, the judgment we have, And it's not a deliberate judgment that we've got on ourselves, but you've just mentioned it. We create those things. We secretly want these bad things, and we've determined something as being bad, haven't we? So we've made a judgment to say this thing over here is bad, and this thing over there is good. But how have we got to that point? How did any of us get to that point? One of the best analogies I had is that if you were to sort of draw a picture of a baby and then stick a big open chalice above its head, and say that's what the mind is, ostensibly when you're born. And so in that, when we're born, when you look at a baby, you'll have seen some, they're basically generally really happy. They're pretty carefree, aren't they? But they don't know much. They don't know much about what's happening. They don't really know that this is their hand until they bite into it, and then they go, it's connected to me, that hurt. Right? They don't really have much of a concept of it. So they're having to learn about everything that's going on around them, and they don't necessarily, there's different beliefs, but they start from a basic premise of what we do know, which is that they're just born into an environment, they didn't plan that, right? And in that environment, you've got people around you who are the people they're learning from. So caregivers, in whichever shape or form those caregivers arrive in their lives. The environment they're in, there's the financial issues that might be going on for them, external pressures, who are the friends coming in, who are the people coming in, what's happening for these caregivers. You've then got whatever religions that are in their lives at that stage will give them rules. They'll give them an understanding of how the world works. They'll give them an understanding of how they work. And all of those sorts of influences are there, including school, including, friends and stuff that we meet, that parents' friends or caregivers' friends. All these different things are coming in to tell us this is who we are, this is who we should be. This is how the world works. And television does that, and books do that, and everything. So that's how we develop our sense of who we are. And in psychology, they would call those schemas, because what we're doing is we're developing like what's almost blueprints. And then we stick them in a little filing cabinet and say, that's what that is. And then we forget about them. They become unconscious. Right? But all these schemas are there in the little blueprints. And when we meet a situation, we rifle through in a nanosecond and pull out a thing saying, that looks like this. And because it looks like this, that must be what it is. So how am I going to respond to that? Well, I've got this process I've developed since I was a kid for responding to it. And I've done the best I can with that process to try and keep me safe as an organism. And part of keeping safe is about keeping love in our lives as well, because love is an incredibly important aspect of that. And if we take children away from any sense of love, what we tend to find is that the children will die. So they need connection. So connection's massive. And so what we tend to do as well is we tend to hide who we truly are. And we hide who we truly are so that we can maintain those connections. So there's bits of us that are alive and we're joyous and we're doing stuff that we want to do. And then as we develop our critical faculty around the age of 7, this sort of the frontal lobe bit, the bit to actually make these logical decisions, when we get to that stage, suddenly we start to become really self-conscious. And then it's little things like, I shouldn't really do that, should I? I really want to though, but I shouldn't do it. And so we develop all these strategies, and our nervous system is responding to those strategies. So things like shutting down your throat, what does that do? Keeps you safe, but how does it, what's it actually doing, would be my suggestion. You can't speak. And if you can't speak, you can't create a problem for yourself, would be the way I'd look at it. And because you can't create a problem for yourself, actually then I'm keeping myself safe, aren't I? And as a consequence of that, an early, idea or understanding of what is unsafe has led to me deciding that if I actually shut up, if I keep my noise down, if I don't speak, I will be safer. I can't be exposed, because if I'm exposed, people will find me out, whatever the reasons are. Now, that's not true, but at the same time, when you're younger, those sorts of ideas can start to infiltrate, and we can create these schemas, these little blueprints, these little files that we stick in, and we say, oh, that's very dangerous. And that's a survival mechanism, Luke, but most of the time it's not accurate. The information we have to make those decisions isn't accurate. Does that make sense?
So what do we do with those situations? So let's say, for example, I mean, use any example that you want. Feel free to use someone that you've seen in the past. You know, it could be ages ago. But what is the process to undo that? If you were to kind of externalize your own process to give an insight into what people
well,
go
I can
through.
use myself even as an example. So I mean, I grew up in an incredibly
Sure.
anxious household. So it's you know, a lot of loss, a lot of difficulties in connecting with other people, and my siblings struggled as a consequence of that. I was the youngest of four, and my older brother died in a cot death just before I was born. So there's the whole family, and they'd had their own issues growing up, my parents, and so the whole family was in a situation where everybody was, bless you, was tense, and they didn't quite know, and they were trying to survive, and they were trying to keep themselves surviving. And what I did was spend a lot of time hiding, because I was sort of mollycoddled a bit by my parents, and then because they've just lost a baby, you can sort of understand the reasoning. But then my older siblings were in a situation where they didn't necessarily find that useful or helpful, or found that threatening. And I became very aware of that as a young kid. And so I would look at them and think, I can't have stuff coming to me. I can't have people, you know, when I have that, it's dangerous. People feel threatened. And that's my fault that that's happening. And so I grew up isolating myself. I had no sort of, you know, just very anxious and isolating myself. And it was only when I started to become aware of why that was happening and how the mind works to a large extent that I started to deal with those issues. And hypnotherapy was helpful in that, but it wasn't the only thing. There's lots of things. So hypnotherapy, from my perspective, is a tool to help us get to a point where we can actually have a conversation with the bit that's in charge, which is the bit in these schemas that's driving the bus, that's saying, this is how we do this, and this is how we do that. All these unconscious processes. And so learning about all that stuff really sort of opened me up a great deal. It did take some time, but it opened me up. I could feel it bit by bit as time went on. And I think that the way to do it is to become very aware of why it's happening, because often we can start blaming ourselves for the fact that these things are going on. And that's what I've noticed with people. People shut down. I mean, I've been working with people for over 30 years in mental health, and it's like, you know, people shut down. And they've got this belief that they can't do anything, that they're broken, that basically that's it. And because we don't have an instant cure for that sort of stuff, we end up in a situation where we're doing our best as professionals to try and manage the situation. But all I see is an individual in front of me who doesn't really believe that they have much worth or much chance. And so that I'm pretty passionate about helping people recognise that that's not the case, if that makes sense.
I have an interesting question on that. What is the, in my words, the moral consequence of that? So if you see someone who perhaps has done, let's just use the word shitty things in the past, right? Excuse my profanity. And they're things that most people would deem to be irreprehensible. How do you, given what you know about the mind and human nature and change and those kind of things, do you see those behaviors as still bad, I imagine, but as something that can be changed or fixed? And is that, I guess, when people are bringing up, like, you know, blaming or stories around someone doing something wrong to them, or, you know, people that are in trouble doing the wrong thing in the law, I I guess my question is, with these individuals, because you know what you know about the mind, is it hard to see the bad in people, or do you think that's just a part of human nature?
No, because I'm human, so I can see the bad, but I can be conscious of the fact that I think what I've become aware of over the years is that nobody can create an emotion in you, right? The problem is we tend to blame everybody else outside of us for creating all the emotions, or all the things outside of us for creating those emotions. Problem then is that gives us absolutely no control, does it? And so what I'll look at is that really and truthfully, people can do something, and I will have reactions and responses within me. And those are my reactions and responses based on my schemas, my knowledge, my experiences. And so I suppose when I'm meeting somebody, I have to ask myself the question, can I actually help this person? I have to be mindful of where I'm at. If I'm in a situation where I'm triggered by whatever's happened, then maybe I'm not going to be the best person to help that individual. But it doesn't mean that that person can't necessarily change, but the change has to come from them. It's like, working with people in really difficult situations, say where they're suicidal and stuff. I've had enough phone conversations with people in those scenarios where it's just, you can't necessarily change or stop that situation from happening. What you're doing is you're building a bridge. So you're building a bridge for them that they may choose to cross, but you do that in part by just being there for them and genuinely being there for them, hearing them, listening to them, getting those experiences so that they feel heard, and then you can allow them, hopefully, when you hold space for them, they may decide to cross. And we can explore some of the things to try and expand their perspective a little bit. And that's what I'd be doing with the people in that situation. But as far as I've met people who've done what could be considered terrible things, and there may have been reasons why they were doing that at the time that were beyond their control. But that's difficult. It's a case-by-case basis, really. But the change has to come from them, but it starts from them recognising why they did what they did and starting to work on that and make decisions about that. So from the moral perspective, I can't really, morality's an individual thing, isn't it? It depends on how people are deciding on what's good and what's bad and what should or shouldn't happen. And I would look at it from the perspective of, well, they've done what they've done, I can't change that. But is there hope and is there potential within that person to change who they are and come out the other side? And the only person who can actually answer that is them. What I know is for a fact is that, there's a possibility of that, but it just depends on how they look at things, would be how I'd say it.
So in the 30 years of doing this, is there, I guess, a handful of lessons that you've learned, I guess, about human nature and people, but then also for your own life? I imagine, doing this podcast is obviously not the same as taking someone through change, but it is a version of that, because I think conversation, I think this is why conversation is so important. Speaking to the political side of things and freedom of speech and things like that, to what extent, not the story, but what I'm saying is that speech is so important because it does help to create change, and it can be both positive and negative. But I guess being this podcast, I've learned a lot of things about human nature, about people, about myself. So what have you learned from doing this, 30 plus years? I'm looking at your website and you've done a lot of things. You're trained and accredited in, somatic trauma therapy, strategic psychotherapy, ACT, DBT, CBT, solution-focused therapy, solution-oriented hypnotherapy, the rewind technique, and also NLP as well. So I guess from all the work that you do and all the stuff that you're involved in, what have you learned about human nature and about people?
Well, what I've learned is fundamentally, I think most people are good, is one of the things I've learned. And most people are doing the best they can.
Interesting.
I think, that's been one of the fundamentals. The problem is somebody once drew a picture of a stick person, right? and said one of her therapists had just put a little dot in the middle of the tummy and said, that's your schizophrenia. Okay? Who else are you? And this is, I think, the problem, that we focus so much on one individual idea about who we are, that we lose sight of who we actually are, really fundamentally. Because, as I'd said earlier, there's that sort of idea about where we learn to be who we are and we learn about the world and we create these schemas and we stick them in the back of our database and then we're unconsciously referencing them as we're going through the world, saying that's how I do this and that's how I do that. You know, we're in a situation where we've developed what would be said to be an identity. And the identity is ostensibly the ego, because the ego is just the identity we've created. It isn't some demon thing, it's just this identity we've created. Some people are more fragile than others. Some people are much more, say, demanding than others, because they demand these things to be a certain way. But, you know, anger in its own right is a way of feeling a sense of control, because everybody's been angry. And when you're angry, just for that few seconds, seconds when you're angry, you feel totally in control. Have you ever noticed that? And yeah, but then it drifts away. And then you get the shame and guilt and other things that would pop in as well around the fact that you've just been angry, or the other person then gets angry. They think, oh, that wasn't justified. Why did I do it? But you know, it's about trying to get control, because this is the basis of needs. We all have needs. We need to feel that sense of control, but we equally, on the other end of the seesaw, want to have uncertainty. So we have this desperate need for certainty, but we want uncertainty. We want variety in our lives. We want things to be a bit different, the unexpected to happen, because it gives us a nice sense of wow. It gives us excitement. Gives us something joyful. Those are the things you have conversations with people about, the unexpected stuff. So we desperately want it, but then we're really terrified of it. But that's where most of life is in that unknown, the uncertain space. But we can't necessarily feel safe when we're in that space. I think Tony Robbins said something about the quality of your life is directly proportional to your ability to manage uncertainty or handle uncertainty. And so I think that's a truism. I think, you know, that's one of those things that we're all so caught up in wanting the certainty that we create these little boxes for ourselves. And those little boxes where we have all of our ideas about what's right, what's wrong, who we are, how we are, and who we should be. But when we go beyond those boxes, there's far more to us. That's what I've discovered in life.
So in the field of psychology and, you know, in the space of people who help people, someone as I would consider yourself, I imagine there's a proclivity, you know, naturally for those individuals. Again, this is just an assumption. I'm just putting an idea out there that individuals that work in that field, they tend to probably be a bit more sensitive towards people and towards, they have more compassion for others, right? And I think if you don't have a proclivity towards that, you might not do too well on the role. And perhaps if you have too much of that, you might overwhelm you, the stories you hear and the things you go through. For myself, I would consider myself someone who's a sensitive person in a lot of ways. And my upbringing, you know, my path away from the pain was to numb those feelings. And only as an adult now in my 20s and particularly late 20s, have I learnt that it's okay, you know, to be compassionate, to care. But the challenge that I've come across when I've, you know, brought that version of myself, or rather let that version of myself reign free, so to speak, is that it is so easy to want to do everything for everyone, and you care so much that you put yourself in harm's way, so to speak, not so much physically, but, you know, emotionally and mentally. And you don't have boundaries, right? Now, there's a lot of talk out there around boundaries, and I think that it's probably often over-spoken about, but I don't think it's a bad thing, some parts at least. So I guess the question I'm trying to put together, or the topic I'd love to speak about is, as someone doing this for 30 years, right, whether someone out there is in the same kind of position you are as far as helping people who, you know, help people, or they're individuals who are just sensitive people. You know, perhaps it's some 18-year-old in Sydney somewhere or across the world who's just a very sensitive male, which is often seen as a negative thing. How do they, how do we allow our compassion to come out? And the thing that you used is that people are at their core good, right? That's my own terminology, but they're good. People are good. How do you draw a line and also remain compassionate? How have you done that for the past 30 years? And I guess what can people do that are, that are sensitive people?
Look, I mean, those are separate questions, and there's a few different answers. But I mean, from my perspective, how I manage that is to remind myself that that's a human being in front of me, and to remind myself of what that individual may have been experiencing. And when I understand that, in essence, you see, the problem I've got is when you understand what's going on for all of us as human beings, when you understand that all of us have thoughts, don't we? Right? And those thoughts flood through our brains. There's, I don't know, 52, 60 odd thousand a day or something, somebody sort of said, which is a lot. And yeah, they're going through our brains. Most of those are unconscious. And most of those are based on these little schemas, these ideas that we have, sort of unconscious mind trying to make sense of the world and trying to make decisions based on that. So a lot of it we're not aware of, but we've got all of these thoughts going through our head. Now, when you grab hold of a thought, what you do is you amplify the thought, right? So if you've, put it this way, there's one of the things I do sometimes with people is just look at it from a point of view of, if you can think of something, Luke, that absolutely gives you a sense of joy, whatever that might be, right? And if you were to picture that thing that gives you a sense of joy, you can feel that in you, can't you? And you can see it and you can feel that. And I can see the shift in your affect, the face, you've just lit up. But now, and the smile, so that's a thing that's available to you that wasn't there a couple of seconds ago, but now it is. Now, if you were to think of something that was a nasty situation, a situation that made you really, really anxious or made you really, really angry, one of those two, whatever that feeling was, can you picture that?
Yeah, I can.
All right. And can you feel that? Can you
Of course, but I'm holding it back.
Which is fine. But can you notice the feelings inside you in relation to that?
Of course.
Now, what was that thing that you were joyful about? Think about that thing that you were joyful about just then. There was something that lit you up earlier. Well, you don't have to tell me necessarily what it was, but it's something that lit you up. And
it's honestly the joy of conversation.
Joy of conversation, but you lit up, didn't you? And can you feel that?
Yeah.
You got pictures in your mind about it. And have you now?
Yeah, more sounds, but yeah.
Yeah, have you now noticed a difference in the feelings in your body physiologically? How long did it take for you to shift from one feeling to the next feeling?
About 2 seconds.
About 2 seconds.
less.
Or less. And that's the power of thought on our lives. Or you could say that's the power of focus on our lives. Because that's all that we're looking at, really, is that all of us walk through life and we have a focus. So where is your focus? So if that's not answering your question about the sensitive individuals, I get it, but at the same time, it's sort of getting a picture of how we work. So if my focus is on this, somebody once described it as being like a river of thought. So if you have this, it's like all these thoughts come from somewhere. Nobody knows where, really. Neuroscience hasn't worked it out yet, but it's coming from somewhere, and then they sort of vanish. And they're on this river. But if I look at that river, some of those things are going to be flowers. They're going to be lovely things like the joyous thing. Some of them are going to be turds, which is the bad thing, right? Now, if I pick up one of the turds, I'm going to have a bad experience. If I pick up one of the flowers, I'm going to have a really nice experience, depending on what it is. If I just let them pass, they'll pass. Does that make sense? Right?
It does.
So understanding that where our focus is and where we're at is based on whether, will determine how we feel. Now, they've also done research on this So from an acceptance and commitment therapy perspective, there's the research on this around the idea of fusion with your thoughts, of cognitive fusion, this idea that if I focus in on one particular thought, I'm going to have that experience physiologically, right? Whereas if I don't, if I focus on a different thought, I'll have a different physiological experience, which is what you've just gone through, right? So their idea is about getting you back to being present, so cognitive diffusion. So it's about distancing yourself from those thoughts. Recognizing those thoughts as actually not being who you are. They're just passing bits of information that may or may not be true. And when we understand that, and that that's what's going on, then we understand that all human beings are going through that experience. So I would remind myself that that's a human being who's having that and maybe focused in on something that they're seeing as a bad thing. And when we do that, whatever we focus on, we amplify. So it's going to expand. And when it expands, it feels like overwhelming, like that's all there is. There's nothing else. And that's who we are. And then we start telling ourselves stories about who we are and what we are. And so some of those, and then we need to try and respond as best we can. And sometimes that's anger. Sometimes that's shutting down. Different ways that we do it. Now I need a drink.
And so, yeah, go for it. Take your time. So when an individual who is that sensitive person, are you saying, just to phrase it back to you, that if someone, and again, thoughts, emotions, we can kind of, they're obviously different, but we can kind of put in the same bucket in this example. But would you say that someone who is feeling that what someone else might be feeling, or what their reflection of what they think they're feeling is, that when they feel that, rather than taking that on as an emotion that they have to take action on, letting it go and let it be like leaves floating down a river, as Eckhart Tolle would say?
To some extent, but you have to, to do that takes a bit of practice, because what we've got used to, I presume the same for you, for every human being I've ever met, is that we'll tend to hold on to these thoughts and then we believe they're true.
Yeah.
And that's one of the biggest burdens we've created for ourselves, is to believe that they're true. When we actually sort of think, actually, no, that's just me having this experience again, isn't it? Lots of people say, I got into a habit many years ago of starting to say next, every time they would come in, because I can't control them, but next. So when the individual who's incredibly sensitive, recognise that sensitivity is coming from within you, and recognise that there's nothing that you've done that's bad. You're not doing anything bad by being sensitive. It's just you're having that experience. But it's trying to work out what can I actually control and what I can't. Because one of my big things used to be that I would desperately try and fix everything and fix everybody who was around, or try and solve the problems. And you just can't do it. And when you understand that, there's a difference between being sort of, overly sensitive and desperately trying to help people, and being compassionate. And I think the difference with the compassion is the fact that what you're actually doing is you recognise the human being there and you feel for that human being. And then you can hold space for that human. You can just be there. Sometimes just being there is all you have available. And that's sometimes all people need. But some people need space too. And so it's just, when they know that you're there for them, then that's a fabulous thing. But sometimes we can create a thought in our head that actually I must fix this. And why can't I fix this? And why is the world so bad? And why is this so bad? And then what we're doing is we're going to do what you just did, which is when I focus in on that thing, our neurological system is going to have a response to that, because it doesn't know the difference. If you're focused in on something, it just says, oh, that must be real. Therefore, I'm going to prepare for that. And so then we go into a stress response. And this is one of the biggest problems in the Western world, is that, majority of it's in a stress response, which is fight and flight stuff. And that creates a lot of problems. So it's trying to get ourselves out of that as much as we can.
It is so easy in those states to demonize a group of people or someone else, right? And nowhere more often is this than in intimate relationships, where it's so easy to make your partner the wrong one, make them the person that's doing this or doing that. You're disrespectful, you're rude, you're this, that, whatever. It is so easy to do that because, I guess, because it's also they're a reflection of your thoughts so close to you that you almost mistake them. You mistake it as their problem, as opposed to yours. Now, I think that when it comes to responsibility, there is obviously what part did I play in this? But when it comes to relationships, it's so easy to fall into relationships specifically, but all relationships generally, it is so easy to fall into the victimizer kind of way of being. Why is that with intimate relationships, in your opinion? And I guess, what do you see in practice? Do you see, what is the most common theme? Is it that people are in a stress state and they need to calm themselves down and find space for that? Is it that, I guess the question I'm asking is a few questions. I'm always asking a few questions at once, but one of them is, why does trauma, or triggers, or whatever word you want to use, come up so often in relationships? And are you seeing that happen more often in your practice?
I'm not seeing it happening more often. I think it's always been the case. I think it's part of human, because if as I said, we come in as this blank slate with this little chalice and we take in everything. So from the age of sort of 0 to 7 or whatever, you're pretty much really programmable, because most of the time you're running in our brain. The way our brain communicates is in different, is through electrical signals and stuff. And they run at different speeds. So now, today, we're in sort of a beta thing, which is how everybody is. They're in that brainwave state, and we walk around and we're just sort of very focused on ourselves and on, what's immediately going on around us. But we lose touch very much with this unconscious part of ourselves, right? But that's the bit that's driving the bus. Now, somebody wants to describe that as being like, we as the individual are like an ant, and we're sitting on the back of an elephant, right? And we've decided we want to go that ways, but the elephant's going that way. And we're going, why can't I go that way? Because you're not driving the bus. The unconscious processes, the things that are desperately trying to protect you, are driving the bus. Now, as we grow up, we build this identity as to who we are. And the identity is basically a picture, an image we have of who we are, a concept of who we are. The good, the bad, the indifferent. Now, we've all been taught that we need to be in relationships and we need to have, and that to be perfect, television tells us this, everything tells us this. We must have 2.4 children, so we must complete school, go to university, have many partners if you're a man, have very few if you're a woman. That's what society's telling us. And then we must find the perfect mate. And then we must get married, have 2.4 children, which instantly tells you it's a lie, because what's 0.4 of a child? God knows.
I feel sorry for that child.
Yeah. So you end up in that situation where that's the blueprint of how our lives should be if they're going to be perfect. We should have a job, this career that's great, and we get a lot of money, and we have a house and a mortgage, go on holiday once or twice a year. Then we retire, and then we die. And that's it, pretty much. We might have grandkids in between that. And we're supposed to get old, and we're supposed to become decrepit, and then we're supposed to almost return to childlike behaviours and end up in nursing homes and stuff. That's the pathway. And we're stuck on this pathway. So what the problem is that's not true. That's based on these ideas that we've had in what Freud would have called the superego. So this external concept of what's important in the world that drives us and creates this idea of what we should be. But the truth is, inside us, we know there are other things that are really important to us. There are things that make us come alive. And those are the things that actually who we are. But because we're not living up to it, we're trying to hide all the time, which is Jung's persona concept. So we put these masks on so that the tribe won't recognise that we're so faulty. So the tribe won't recognise and sort of send us away, and then we die in the wilderness. So it's a survival thing. And so we've got to hide who we are. And we learn that from a young age, because when we believe everything is our responsibility. So we're egocentric as children. Because basically, otherwise, how would we get to a point where we got our nappies changed or get fed or get any of these sorts of things happening? unless we cried and interrupted our parents, right? So we're quite egocentric, but we're equally egocentric when it comes to emotions because we believe everything is our responsibility. So when somebody's having a bad day, that's our fault. What is it I've done? And then we start to shut ourselves down and develop this image of who we are and believe that all love comes externally. And that to get it, I need to be a certain way, have this persona, be a certain way. And so we go out into the world with these egos, which is this identity that isn't necessarily true to who we are. So we're incongruent with ourselves, and that creates stress by its very nature. So then we enter into relationships and we're trying to be something we're not. And the other person's done the same. And so somebody described it as being almost like you've got 4 people in a relationship, the 2 genuine people plus their egos. And it's like, and that's going to clash at times. We're going to have moments where that clashes. And as a consequence of that, that's where you get the issues you're describing. The problem is when you realise that that's what's happening for the person, one of the best ways I've found to deal with that is actually just to think, I wonder what their experience is as an individual. What is it that's going on for them? And to actually sort of put yourself in their place, in their shoes almost, if you can. And then you develop a sense of compassion for them and you can be a bit more present for them. And maybe there's a chance there where communication can start to come back. But it's recognising that's going on.
So it's a genuine curiosity for people. And it's like, why are they doing this? Like, where's that coming from? And being actually genuinely curious rather than feeling like you're under attack. It's like,
absolutely.
What is this for you? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And so around the thing you said around, being kicked out of the tribe, so to speak. Now we all have things about ourselves that we rather keep secret sometimes, right? What are how do we go about addressing those parts of ourselves, if there is a way to do that, without, risking doing behaviors that are probably not they're probably not good behaviors to have in public or in, what I'm trying to say is that for individuals who have this part of themselves that they're suppressing, should it be released? And if it should be released, how should it be released? And is there a healthy way to do that?
Well, you're sort of talking the shadow side of Jungian psychology, aren't you? But I mean, it depends what it is. Because for most of us, authenticity is probably one of the most important things we can ever have in life, right? Being true to ourselves. We don't necessarily need to tell everybody how we feel, but as long as we're being genuine with who we are, in ourselves, we know, that's why I'm doing that. Oh, this is how I feel. Then we can work through those feelings. We can work through that stuff and start to have it take less power away from us, all right? So it's like that river of thought thing, or it's popping past all these things, and we're just holding on to some of that. So I shouldn't be this way, or I should be this way. We can let these things go. So it's just the mind. It's just me having a moment where I'm thinking, having a little lower level of consciousness, where I'm thinking this way. But if it's something you love and you're not doing it, and it's not necessarily going to hurt anybody, then I'd be asking the question, well, wonder why that is. What's stopping you from actually doing that? I think people tend to prefer people who are genuine, prefer people who are authentic. They prefer somebody who's themselves, but that doesn't mean that we have to get on with everybody. That doesn't mean that we're going to end up in a situation where everybody's going to like us or like what we do. But as long as we are being true to ourselves, what we tend to find is the stress levels go down. Because I think some of the stress is about living in this falsehood, living with these false masks, these personas. Then what we tend to find is people actually warm to us and will come to us and will have conversations with us and will feel more relaxed around us because they can actually feel that genuineness coming from them, from that person. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah, because I think this is the problem. It's where have we determined that something's bad? We've got that from a lot of other people's ideas rather than it being from ourselves. And I think all the answers lie within us. as individuals. And part of hypnotherapy is about helping people reach that point where they can have those conversations with themselves and then actually genuinely see that. When we realise we've been trying to protect ourselves for such a long time by being something we're not, and that actually we don't no longer need to do that, then we free ourselves. And it's that freeing of ourselves which is the best experience we can possibly have, because everybody wants to be happy. But we're constantly putting that on things outside of us, saying this thing, this car or this relationship or this thing, and suddenly I'll be happy, this job, and suddenly I'll be happy. And it's not true. When we can relax with being who we are, that's where the happiness comes from. It doesn't mean we don't get ups and downs, because that's just part of life. Life is uncertain. There is no certainty in nature, as someone said. And so yeah.
Go for it.
No.
I was just going to say, so for those...
Yeah. Right, no, carry on.
I was going to say, just for those who are listening, and I guess for this conversation as well, how do we get free? How do we become free? I imagine it would be, doing some work with yourself or someone similar, but I guess for those who don't have maybe the resources or they're not in that place at the moment, what is the process to get free, so to speak?
Well, it's recognising the truth of what's actually happening and how we work. So in essence, when you understand how the mind works from that point of view, that it's just trying to make sense of the world, which is why when we walk into a situation, two people come out and have different opinions, because they've got different schemas, they've got different filing cabinets of experiences. We don't have enough information. So when we understand that that's all we're doing, and we understand that our nervous system is trying to protect us, that's what the stress is. The stress response is because it believes we're in danger. When you understand those things, it takes a touch of the edge off, okay? When you understand your thoughts aren't actually always true, and you can ask yourself questions. I think Byron Katie is interesting person to read in there. He went from major depression and stuff and difficulties, and suddenly realised it was just her thoughts. And then asks herself those 3 questions or 4 questions, which is it true? Or is it not true? And there's only really a yes or no to those answers. And if the answer is yes, it is true, then you can say, well, how can you be certain? Can you be 100% certain? Can you be completely and utterly certain that what you're thinking is true? And the answer to that is always no, from what I've experienced, because there's always going to be a gap in that certainty, because most of it's an imagined thing in the future. So when we can understand that, then we understand that actually maybe things aren't as bad as I think, right? But the way that you deal with that is you actually start trying to just train yourself to relax a bit more. So we talked a bit about the beta brainwave, sort of, the speed at which your thoughts are at. Most creativity comes in alpha, which is a slower speed. So when we slow down, we take that critical faculty out of the way, and we actually become more present, and we're in a situation where our imagination starts to spark more. We can be much more creative, far more relaxed. And so there's many ways of doing that you can do. So different things, there's breathing techniques. Just simply, if you were to breathe through your nose and then out through your mouth, and do that again, you probably find your brain slowing down just a tiny bit. And then the suggestion would then be, if you then place your attention on any part of your body that you want to place your attention on, say your hands, for instance, right? You'll start to feel sensations in those hands. And when you can feel those sensations, you're present. Simple as that. So you can do that and take a pause just before you have a conversation with somebody. That's one simple way that you can do that throughout your life, right? There's many others. There's what they call it, physiological sigh, which is just,
yes,
when people stop crying, They tend to just breathe quickly through their nose and then out through the mouth. So it's just like, your nervous system calms. It's to do with the vagus nerve. So what they've worked out is that the entire nervous system.
Where you go to party, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely. It's very deserty and there's lots of gambling, but only in the sympathetic
Yes, that's
parts.
what I thought.
Right, but in the parasympathetic parts, it realises that the gambling's unnecessary, and it realises that it's, most of it's make believe in the vagus strip.
You're in the desert at that point.
Yeah, that's right. And so then suddenly it's calm, and it calms down. So we work in that sort of way where we're relatively calm, and then the sympathetic nervous system is just there to help us move. So our sympathetic nervous system gets this bad rap as being this terrible thing that, when we're stressed, we're in sympathetic. Well, yeah, we are. But generally it has a function outside of that. Its function is to help us move. It's how you are. I just did that. It's how we get around. It's how we get excited and we do stuff. It's how you be able to run and do other things. And then you got your dorsal vagal right down the bottom, which is managing your digestion and other things. Now, all of that's working perfectly in harmony for us until we get to a point where we feel in danger, we feel threatened. And when we feel threatened, what happens is that we go into the sympathetic response and they change their jobs. So suddenly the sympathetic thing is saying, right, I've got to shut stuff down. So we need a lot of energy because we've got to run away or we've got to fight this thing, right? And so because we need a lot of energy, what's using up that energy? Well, your frontal cortex, the bit that's giving you the logical and the reason, uses up most of the energy in your body. So that gets taken offline pretty much because there's no point having that. Your digestion then gets taken offline because that takes up an inordinate amount of energy. And then your immune system gets taken offline because that takes up an inordinate amount of energy. And so suddenly then we've got the energy we need to fight or run away, right? The problem is that because most of us are running in a low level of that sympathetic thing, we get digestive problems, right? It's hard for us to actually manage, think of solutions to things because the frontal cortex is out of operation. We get prone to illness because our immune system now, the defenses in our immune system, there's loads of viruses and stuff in there, but what happens is that the walls and the barriers are keeping them out. When we're in a stress response, because that's using up so much energy, comes down. Now they will slipping in. This is why we get prone to sickness. So it's all those things. So when we can get ourselves de-stressed and recognise the truth about what's happening, bring ourselves back into alpha most of the time, and just breathe, relax. What we tend to find is the immune response goes back up. We can be more logical and solve things. Digestion resolves itself. And we have a slightly happier life, right? Doesn't mean we're not going to get hit with stress, but it just means that, maybe we'll manage it and it will have less of an impact on us.
And for those who are looking for less stress in their life and they want to learn how to do this with you in person, where should they go?
Well, you can go to my website, so hypnotherapiesolutions.com.au, australia.com.au. And book a session with me if you want to. That's not a problem at all.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak. It's been a pleasure. And I'll speak to you very soon.
And you, Luke. Take care, mate. Bye.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Getting Mental podcast. If you like this episode, then you'll love this one here and this one here. Check them out.